This is the third of 4 videos that will teach you how to diagram an argument. In this one, we're actually going to finally draw that diagram. Let's begin with a brief recap of what we covered in the previous videos. We know what an argument is. Someone is trying to get us to do or believe something and is giving us reasons to do so. We know that arguments come in 2 different kinds, deductive and inductive. And we know that sometimes as we're reading a passage of text that includes an argument, there may be a few sentences, transition phrases, definitions, examples, or something that do not actually play a role in the text. We may also have some premises to the argument that are not in the text. So when we generate a list of statements that play a role in the text, we'll have to add those in. That's our job. Get the list, know all the statements that actually are an element of the argument, which we did in the last video. Now we're ready. We can draw a diagram that will show the logical flow of the argument. Let's begin by looking at how you would diagram a deductive argument. In the first video, we used this as an example. Asia won't eat that lasagna. She's a vegetarian. First, let's generate our list of statements. We know one statement is that Asia won't eat that lasagna, and that another is that she's a vegetarian. But there seems to be an awful lot assumed and unstated here. Vegetarians don't eat meat, and Asia will not eat meat because she's a vegetarian. Last, that the lasagna has meat in it. None of this would make sense if it was a vegetable lasagna. How do we draw a picture of this argument? The first step in any argument diagram is to take the conclusion and put it at the bottom of the page. What this author is trying to get us to believe is that Asia won't eat the lasagna. So we put that statement at the very bottom of the page. We then are going to put our premises above that and show how they lead down to the conclusion. So we know Asia's a vegetarian and that vegetarians don't eat meat. Those 2 statements together work as a team to prove to us that Asia will not eat meat. Think about it. Because she's a vegetarian and vegetarians don't eat meat, she doesn't eat meat. To indicate that these 2 premises work together as a team, we use a bracket. You notice that the line from 2 to A comes together, joins it as a team before it leads down to B. This tells me that it's a deductive argument. You'll remember that the key difference between a deductive argument and an inductive argument is that in the deductive argument, there is a connection between the premises that is so strong that it 100% guarantees the truth of the conclusion, and that connection is important. The 2 premises work as a team. We indicate that, as I said, with this brace. So we've established that Asia will not eat meat. We add to that the fact that the lasagna has meat in it, and again, in the same way, we have a deductive argument to prove that Asia won't eat this lasagna. So this is what a deductive argument will look like. Now let's look at how you would diagram an inductive argument. Here's an example. Look, his fingerprints are on the weapon. John is clearly the murderer. Also, you know, I saw him arguing with the victim the day before the murder. This author is trying to get us to believe that John is the murderer. Let's see if we can outline the elements of that argument by making a list of statements. John's fingerprints are on the weapon, right there in the first sentence. The next sentence gives us the statement that John is the murderer. Last, we are told that it looks like he has a motive. He argued with the victim the day before. How do we draw an inductive argument? Again, we're going to take the conclusion and put it at the bottom of the page. This is John is the murderer. That's what this author is trying to get us to believe. so we put number 2 at the bottom. We then put our premises above that. In this case, instead of a deductive argument where the two premises work together as a team to prove the conclusion, we have a number of independent reasons for the conclusion, which is the hallmark of an inductive argument. To indicate that, we draw a separate line from each of the premises to the conclusion. This is what an inductive argument will look like. Looked at a diagram for a deductive argument and a diagram for an inductive argument. But sometimes an argument can include both. One sub-argument will be deductive, another will be inductive, but they will all work together to lead to the final conclusion. Let's look at an example. If John was home, the lights would be on. Clearly then, John was at home at the time of the murder. Further, John had no motive to kill the victim. Therefore, John is innocent. This author seems to disagree with our previous one and is trying to get us to believe that John is innocent of the crime. Let's draw out our statements. We know that one of the first things we can do to identify the premises and conclusions that play a role in an argument is to circle the indicator words, and we have some here. Further. Although it doesn't look like one, further is a number-like premise indicator. An author will often tell us that he or she has a number of reasons to support the conclusion, and may use number words like first, this, second, that, third, another, and so on. But sometimes, just to keep from being too boring, the author will mix up her or his language by saying something like first, one thing, also, another, third, something, further, another reason, in addition, and just kind of work through it by changing up the language to keep the passage interesting. This word further functions in that way. What's interesting about number-like premise indicators is they tell us that this premise is on the same level as the other premises in that group. So when we go to draw the diagram, we will remember that. Next, we have the conclusion indicator, therefore. So now we know which one of these statements is the conclusion of the argument. Let's make our list. The first premise is, if John was home, the lights would be on. Now let's make a little side note about if-then statements. An if-then statement is called a conditional. What it says is that if the first part, the condition, happens, then the result will follow. In this case, the condition is John being home. If that condition turns out to be true, then the lights will be on. That's the result. The first part of any conditional, the if phrase, is, as you may guess, iffy. The author is not claiming in this sentence that John was in fact home. All that is being claimed is that if John was home, the lights would be on. What is asserted as true is the entire relationship between John being home and the lights being on. No one is saying at this point that either one of those halves of that relationship is true. What should you take away from this explanation of conditionals? If you see an if-then statement in an argument, keep it together. Do not break it up into two premises. Sometimes we do think, I should make premise number 1, John was home, and premise number 2, the lights were on. But that wouldn't be true to what this author is saying. All that this sentence does is assert the relationship between John being home and the lights being on. So if you have an if-then statement, keep it together as one statement in your argument. So there it is, number 1, if John was home, the lights would be on. Now this author seems to want us to assume that the lights were in fact on at the time of the murder. This is not clearly stated, in the argument, but it's implied by the next premise. John was at home at the time of the murder. Now we have that further, John had no motive for the murder. We know that this is going to be on the same level as the premise I've numbered number 2. And last, we have the conclusion. John is innocent. As we go to draw our diagram, we're going to put the conclusion at the bottom. We're then going to start with our first premise at the top. If John was home, the lights would be on. The lights were, in fact, on, and therefore John was at home at the time of the murder. Apparently, the author is trying to provide John with an alibi. These two premises, if John was home, the lights would be on, and the lights were on at the time of the murder, are linked together in the form of a deductive argument. So we're going to use the brace to show that they're working together as a team to prove premise number 2. We then know premise number 3 is on the same level as premise number 2, thanks to our number-like indicator further. But these two are independent reasons. He has an alibi and he has no motive. Either one of those could be true or false without affecting the truth or falsity of the other. So again, we're going to draw separate lines and show that as an inductive argument. Many of your argument passages will be like this one, with some brackets and some inductive drawings. Now, let's take all of these skills you've just learned and see if you can draw a diagram on your own. Using the list you generated while we were going through the previous video, see if you can draw a diagram of the argument that Don Marquis gives that the reason killing is wrong is because it deprives a victim of his or her future. You can pause this video while you draw your diagram and then come back and see what I came up with. Here's my diagram. Now your diagram may look slightly different. That happens. People can have different interpretations of a passage. If your diagram is completely different from someone else's, maybe you should worry a little that somebody's got something wrong. But if it's only slightly different, it just may be a matter of interpretation. So how can you check your diagram and find out if you've done it correctly? One thing you can do is to add premise indicators to any of the premises in the argument and link them to the following conclusion with a conclusion indicator and just see if the sentence makes any sense. Let's try that with this diagram. I'm starting at the top left with premise A. That one said, the loss of your future is worse than the loss you would receive from another crime, such as the loss of property or health. So I'm going to say, because the loss of your future is worse than these other losses, we can conclude that killing deprives victims of more than other crimes, which is statement number 3. That makes sense, so I'm feeling pretty good about that part of the diagram. Let's continue. Number 3 now functions as a premise to prove number 2. So here's number 3 again. Killing deprives victims of more than other crimes. And based on that, we can conclude that our theory that it is the loss of the future that makes killing wrong accounts for our moral intuition that killing is one of the worst crimes. That makes sense because it's more of a loss, therefore we're right to think it's the worst crime. Okay, we've got that. 3 leads to 2 in a way that makes sense to us. So now we're going to read off the last sub-argument. Because this theory explains our moral intuitions well, and because People who are dying of cancer or AIDS feel that it is the loss of their future that makes that horrible. We can conclude that what makes killing wrong is the loss of the victim's future. In other words, I can claim that my theory is true. This all flows logically and makes a lot of sense. You may want to take a moment now and use the premise and conclusion indicators to read your own diagram and see if everything makes sense. You can pause the video while you're doing so, and when you're done, come back and we'll move on to the next slide. Now we're going to do the same thing with the argument about capital punishment from procon.org that we discussed in the previous video. As before, pause the video now, pull out your list of statements, and draw the diagram as best you can. When you're ready, come back and we can compare your diagram with mine. Here's my diagram. Does it look like yours? Is it close? Let's look at it and check it as we did the previous one by adding premise indicators and conclusion indicators. I'm starting with, at the top left, the claim that because the death penalty is applied haphazardly, we can conclude that, number 3, criminologists and police chiefs say it doesn't deter crime. Now that doesn't make sense. The fact that it's applied haphazardly does not prove to me that criminologists or police chiefs would say anything. What would prove to me that criminologists and police chiefs say that the death penalty does not deter crime is interviews with criminologists and police chiefs. And I don't have that. So what went wrong here? In the passage, we had the word because between these two statements. And so it looked like 4 was a premise of 3, but it doesn't seem to flow well. Okay, I'm glad I checked it. Let's see what happens if I move this premise over here and connect it to the next conclusion. Let's read it now. Because criminologists and police chiefs agree that a lot of steps, death penalty does not deter interpretation, and you can disagree because it is applied, so it can often lead to a headache. We can conclude that killers will be no more deterred diagramming a passage punishment text than they would read that particular passage really deep. That makes much more sense. Get a lot more out of it than you did the first time you go ahead and check either the rest of my diagram or all of yours. It is time consuming though, so you wouldn't do this by adding premise indicators and conclusion indicators. But if, as you're reading an article, you find a passage that seems like me, you may need to move some things around a little. Slow down, and then you'll have a diagram you really feel good about. Another value of diagramming is that it opens you up to seeing the passage in different ways. You may have questions yourself about, do I put this statement here or there? Is there an applied premise here or not? And so you'll begin to think of different ways of reading that passage. But you may also, as we just did, compare your diagram with someone else's and find that there's another way of seeing the passage. This again deepens your understanding of the passage and leads to a wonderful discussion about the topic itself. So there's a value in that. The value we're going to focus on in the next video is that drawing a diagram sets you up to consider how good the argument is. Is this argument cogent or is it sound? If so, I should be convinced that the conclusion is true. If not, I have the means to argue against the argument I've just looked at. So in the next video, we will begin to consider these terms, cogency and soundness, and how to determine if an argument has these qualities.